Today on A Conversation with Brian, we have Jennifer Lempp, an amazing educator and author of Math Workshop. I can't wait to dig into Jennifer's book, as well as to learn a little bit about Jennifer's story. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome to A Conversation with Brian, Jennifer Lempp. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's good to see you.
It's great to have former colleagues, former Fairfax County colleagues, join me on my show. I had Nardis King a couple of years ago, and so it's just great to have you. At the beginning of each one of my shows, Jen, I ask my guests to talk a little bit about their personal story, their professional journey. And so, who is Jennifer Lempp?
Well, I would say probably along with many people, several different hats I'm wearing at all times. There's the educator side of me, um, you know, 25 plus years in education. And I started off as an elementary school teacher. And as an elementary school teacher, one of the things I hated was teaching math. It was actually
Here
my
you
least
are writing books about math, right?
growth mindset in the
Exactly.
making right here. It's an example of what can happen. I actually really hated teaching math, and I wanted to do better. And so, how do you do better? You do more of it. You practice it more. So I went to teach in a middle school where I got to really focus on mathematics, and from there, really started to love it as I work through a lot of the kinks, which I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about later. Um, I became a math coach and in a school where I learned that as much as I love teaching young children, love teaching middle school, I equally love teaching adults. I love working with adults. I love learning from and with everyone who I get to work with, whether or not they're 6 years old or 36 or 56, there's always something to learn. And then I worked in a central office where I got to be a coach working with teachers and school leaders. And as a district leader there, I got to see school from a different perspective of the decisions leaders need to make when math isn't their only focus, when they need to make decisions about all subject areas and how you kind of balance all of that. On a personal side, I'm a mom of three kids, and I get to see my three kids go through school and talk about the joys and the hiccups of every day.
Yeah.
I get to see when they come home and they were really excited about a day, and it really comes down to those relationships that they have with teachers. Uh, those classrooms where they have strong relationships, I know that they're going to have a really positive day, even when maybe the work gets to be difficult. But I got to see math through their eyes too. I got to see when math really turned them off, and when it started to be kind of a light in their eyes.
Sure, sure. Hey, let's go back
Yeah.
to when Jennifer Lemp was younger, as a young learner, a student. You know, talk to me about your journey as a student. Were you a good student, or did you see yourself as a good student in certain subjects? What did it look like for you?
You know, I really loved school. I loved going to school when I was younger. I played school. I was the person who would take my three siblings and line them up, and
So you were that person.
I really was. But I didn't want to be a teacher, so I kind of fought that for a little bit.
Yeah.
But in the area of math specifically, in the early years, I felt like I was doing okay. What I realized about myself is I was doing okay because I was a good memorizer.
Mm,
And so I didn't really understand and know the math that I was doing, but I was good at memorizing it for the moment. And that falls apart over time.
yeah.
At a certain point, there are just so many folders in your head that you can keep straight, and pretty
Exactly.
soon they all kind of spill out.
Yep.
And when I got to high school, I definitely did not have a conceptual understanding of what I was doing. And that's when things started to fall apart for me. And I had some teachers that were absolutely wonderful that I didn't want to disappoint. And so, in order to get through some of the day, I remember meeting up with a boy in my class who had his locker next to mine. And I would frantically look over his homework and jot down as much as I could. So, there I was, the person who thought I was really good at school in elementary. Falling apart in high school when it came to math and needing to copy homework to be successful because I didn't want to let my teachers down, rather than admitting what I didn't know, because I really didn't even know what questions to ask.
I think a
Um,
lot of us relate to what you're sharing, and I think that's so important. And again, we'll get into your book, but so many people will quote say, "I wasn't a math person," and we know that's not the right language today because we all are math people. It's just we might not be there yet, but it takes us knowing and understanding. And you talked about the conceptual piece of it to really have it anchored in our kind of our intellectual souls, our math souls in order for us to really feel like we have some confidence that we can do this.
Yeah, I definitely lacked the confidence in high school, and I think I had false confidence in elementary school. I felt like I could do it because I could memorize it, but once we got past something like, certain times tables kind of idea, like that was it. Like that's all I could memorize. I needed to truly understand it to be a problem solver, and I wasn't a problem solver.
When we talk about, let's kind of jump into your book.
Yeah.
One, what was the inspiration, for the book? What inspired you to write Math Workshop? And was there a specific moment or challenge in teaching that led you to create this resource for teachers?
I was a math coach at an elementary school and working with teachers on trying to put into practice all of the best practices that we felt like were out there. How do you use a time when you maybe only have 60 minutes,
Yeah,
and every teacher I was working with wanted to do the very best they could. And you have a limited amount of time.
yeah,
And you would find like, oh, there's this really good thing to do, and there's this really fun thing to do, but how do you fit it into a day?
yeah,
And then how do you fit it into a day and maintain the philosophy around these best practices and do what's right for kids?
yeah,
And so working through what could a math class look like that met the needs of all kids, not just a few kids,
yeah,
but truly was able to capture all of the brilliance that these children have, get to know what they don't know yet,
yeah,
and give me an opportunity to address it within the school day. Not something where I was making a list of kids to try to get at lunch or before school or after school, something that we could do within the hours of a school day. And in working through that, I realized at the time, and this was back in 2011, um, there weren't a lot of resources that were written about this. Luckily, now there are many different resources out there that we're fortunate enough to have. But at the time, there weren't a lot. But there seemed to be a lot at the time for like a reading and writing idea.
yeah,
And I was at an Exxon Mobil Teacher Academy conference, and I was kind of complaining about it. And someone overheard me, and I said, there's just nothing out there that's written for this, and I'm doing all this work trying to put this together. And this stranger tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well, why don't you just write it?"
yeah.
And I kind of stood back, and I was like, "Ah, maybe I will." And next thing you
That's
know,
what
on
you do,
the
right? Like if you're complaining about something, I've heard a number of people say that if you complain about it, why don't you write about it? Why don't you be the solution, right? So
I was guilty. I was guilty of complaining and not working on a solution beyond the four walls of our school. And so I decided I was going to start it right then and there. And I was on my way home starting to jot down notes on, napkins, on post-it notes, trying to come up with what would this look like. And luckily, at the time, Mass Solutions was the publisher that had kind of tapped me on the shoulder about this. And they were very patient with me because in 2012, when I really started submitting everything bit by bit, I had a 4-year-old at home and twin 2-year-olds at home. And I had gone back to school for my doctorate.
You know, as we talked about before we started recording, you had a lot of tabs open.
Like the hat so that,
Yeah.
we were. Um, so they were very patient, and that book did not get published until 2017. So when I was definitely a slow writer. Um, Part of it was, personal reasons of like just I wasn't willing to write so fast that I missed anything about my kids. But part of it also was as you're writing, and I see the books that you've written, Brian, and I see all like the references and everything that you just like you read. It's not just
Yeah,
writing. There's
yeah,
input.
exactly. And then as you write, you know, you might start writing and you have an idea in your head when you just initially sit down. But in between that space of writing and publishing, there's so many things that happen that change some of your perspective and change your ideas. So there's a lot of things that go into it. And so, you know, you having maybe 5 years in between the time you started or 6 years in between the time you started and published it, I'm sure things changed in between, and you tweak things along the way.
And nothing that you write you will love later. Like, there are things that now I look at the 2017 book and I'm like, oh, I could just tweak this if I could just
Yes.
this part. But yeah, it took a long time, and the rabbit hole of reading a million books to write one, talking to as many people as possible to make sure that it's practical. I when I write something, of course it makes sense to me, but will it make sense to everyone else who's reading it? And is it practical for teachers who are doing this, not just teaching math? Who's they're planning for everything to include a field trip and parent teacher conferences. So
Yeah. So let's kind of dive into what it looks like. And I'm going to ask you, and I try to do this with, you know, everybody I speak with, especially educators, when I talk to them about, you know, explaining what it looks like. What I'd like for you to try to do is explain to a parent what it looks like. You can explain to an educator and they have some background. But when you explain to a parent or somebody who is not an educator, what does a math, you know, workshop look like? I think that really kind of strips the jargon and really kind of makes you say, this is what it looks like step by step. In your workshop model, you have 5 key steps in that model: understanding the math workshop, preparing your students for math workshop, decide your math workshop structure, you know, facilitating your math workshop, and reflecting and refining that math workshop. So let's start with the beginning. You know, understanding math workshop. If I'm a parent and I hear the word workshop, I'm thinking about tools and, you know, carpentry and, you know, different stations and different places in that room. What is a math workshop?
well, first, I love this idea of explaining it to a parent versus a teacher. And you're right, stripping out the jargon is so important, right? So that we're all on the same page. So I like this idea. I have not done this before, just like tried to only put it in. I've explained it to other parents, but
Yeah.
not like this.
Well, I think, and this is again, you may or may not know my pet peeve, and it, you know, when I was a principal, you know, all the way from when I first started as an educator, you know, when I first started, and I tell this story, I was a phys ed teacher when I first started, and in my first staff meeting, people were using acronyms and jargon, and I had no idea what they were talking about, and I didn't have the confidence to ask. You know, every time somebody would use an acronym, I would be focusing on that acronym, and 5 minutes later they're talking about something else. And so my thing is common language, common knowledge, and common expectations helps us all row and move in the same direction, no matter who we are in the room. And so when with my staff or with our staff, we always said, if we're going to use an acronym, let's make sure everybody in the room knows what it is. We're not going to assume, and we don't want to leave people behind. And so I always say, how can we strip down the jargon, the acronyms as much as we can, so a parent can understand it, or somebody who's not in education can understand it. And so that's kind of what I kind of preach in terms of how do we explain it so no matter who we are, anybody can understand it.
Clarity of language. I'm
Yep.
all for it. I think the first thing I would say then to a parent is I would tell them that I recognize that there's a lot of conversation around this idea of new math, and differences in how math is being taught now. And I think I would just help them to understand that, like, I understand that you were probably taught in much the same way I was taught, in a very traditional way. And that resulted in a whole lot of people feeling like they're not math people, a lot of people feeling like they lack the confidence and that they couldn't go into a field that was going to require mathematics, that they couldn't go into school later in an area of mathematics,
Sure.
and that I don't want those same kind of instructional experiences for your kids. I want the kind of instructional experiences for your kids where they are going to feel like they belong in that classroom, that they could be successful in that classroom, that I believe in them. And I would never want any subject area to create a level of anxiety for a child where they feel like anxious or scared or so overwhelmed that they don't see themselves as capable.
Love that.
So, with that, how do we change those instructional experiences? A math workshop approach can help with that. Because in a math workshop approach, if you think about workshop and you're thinking about maybe those tools, there are a lot of different things happening. And with a lot of different things happening in a classroom, you might think that that's going to be chaotic. But instead, these are really purposeful and thoughtful activities for kids. And not all kids are going to need the exact same thing at the exact same time. I'm sure with your own children at home, like one of them might have walked at 11 months, another one might have walked at 14 months. Just because something is said on a paper of when somebody talks or walks at a certain age, it doesn't always happen on the day, not that exact day. And that's the same way in our classrooms. Um, there are going to be times that we think that a kid is supposed to be doing and this double digit multiplication. And, some of them may already have that when they walk into our classroom and be ready for a lot more. And some of them might need a little bit more practice right now with something because they're not ready for the double digit yet. But I promise you they will be because I believe in them. So the way it looks in our classroom is every day in math, we're going to start with a really positive first impression. We're going to do an activity that's going to be really exciting and engaging. We're going to call that a reasoning routine. So if you ever hear them talk about that, that number sense routine, this is what they're talking about. It's only about 5 or 10 minutes, but the idea is to get them curious and excited about math and make them feel like today is a day that they can be successful, even if they didn't feel that way yesterday. Those first
Ask
five
a
to
question before you go on.
no, what's that?
Can I ask a question before you go on?
Yeah, please.
I love this. I just love the way you're setting this up. And when you talk about the reasoning routine,
Mhm.
helping them be curious and excited, is that routine what they, I don't know if they still call it, what they call a link, where we're linking to an essential learning outcome from that we've said that all kids need to know and be able to do, or is it something different?
Yeah, it can be, Brian. A lot of times I will look for reasoning routines that are going to link in some ways. However, in the area of mathematics, so much builds upon one another that there are a lot of different links that we can do that won't necessarily make someone feel like, oh man, we're about to just start multiplication, for example. Well, if I do a reasoning routine on multiplication, I might turn some kids off, like, oh, I don't know that yet. Um, Fractions is another thing. Like, oh, if I right away put in something with fractions immediately, maybe I might turn some kid off who might feel like I don't know enough about fractions. But maybe I put up some pictures of like a half of a cup of milk, a bite out of a cookie, and I put up some pictures and we say like, what do you notice? What do you wonder? Or, which one of these pictures doesn't belong and why?
And
So
everybody can relate to that.
yes,
Yeah,
yes. And
yeah,
every kid is going to be like activating some of that prior knowledge in their brain about their understanding of fair share and parts of a whole without knowing it.
sure.
So it's that first 5 to 10 minutes is about access, it's about engagement, and it's about discourse. If I can get the kids talking in the first 5 to 10 minutes, they're more likely to talk in the next, 50, 60.
And this is very different from, what most parents have experienced. And, again, most parents, even, younger parents have experienced, sitting in rows and being taught from a book that everybody's learning the same thing at the same time and not having these um, opportunities to be curious and engaged and access prior knowledge.
And honestly, it's very different than the way I taught in my first several years of teaching. I used to give the boring old warm up that I barely planned, barely looked at.
Yeah.
And the idea was basically like sit down and be quiet and start this for the first 5 to 10 minutes so that I could get my act together, so that I could switch over to, oh, now I'm ready to teach math or a new group is coming in. And I was giving the first impression every single day that math is quiet
Yeah.
and it's isolated and you're working by yourself. And oh, well, if you don't know it, it's just a terrible first impression.
And yeah, and so I know we're going to go through this, but Jen, this is so enlightening and also refreshing because you're so reflective on the things that you said, basically. And I like the quote. I can't remember the exact quote, but what I learned, what I learned today does not make yesterday wrong. It makes tomorrow better. That's what you did. I mean, we're not saying you were doing things wrong. You were doing what you knew best at the time, but now you're reflective and you're able to write a book about this to help practitioners and parents understand, from your quote mistakes or your lack of understanding of how we should have taught math, and that's all you knew at the time. Now you're able to put it down in a book and teach and coach people on a way that's going to engage every single child. That's huge.
Well, we can beat ourselves up a lot over the past. We can do, and we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, just as human beings, as
Yeah.
educators, as parents. And I can beat myself up a lot over maybe who I was, but in the end, I just have to try to move forward. And I hope too, because of my experiences, that the people I work with know that my work with them comes with no judgment. I did all of those things too. And I understand that we're all doing the very best that we can. Every day, we're doing the very best we can. And I'm also always going to look for a way to be more efficient and effective. So the what's next, and I'm definitely still not done. I know that there'll be many more iterations
Well,
of
that's
maybe become
we're,
as an
we are
educator.
the learning profession, right? And there's Nobel Peace Prize winner back in the early 1900s. His name was Niels Bohr. And he said an expert is a person who's made every single mistake in their discipline possible. That's an expert.
Yes.
Well, we have made, I mean, that's how, where I am today, 35, 36, 37 years from where I started. I've made all these mistakes and I still will make mistakes. And that's okay because, as you said, this idea of the growth mindset, that's what we want. We want people to know that mistakes are a part of the learning process, not just for kids, but for the adults as well.
Yeah. And, if we say as teachers, I want a classroom that where kids feel like they can take risks
Oh, of course.
and we can normalize mistake making, we need to give ourselves that same grace too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the
We're
model.
going to make mistakes along the way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, we're into the 5-10 minute reasoning part of the lesson. And then what happens next?
Yeah, so we have engagement high. What we don't want is now students to move into like this passive sitting there doing nothing and just watching a teacher,
Yeah.
which is what I used to do. It was watch me solve a problem, watch me solve another problem, and another one, and another one.
I
So
remember.
instead, this is where we move into a focus lesson. This is going to be sometimes that whole group time with kids where we're launching different ideas.
Okay.
What this is, the idea of this though is it's supposed to kind of stay mini. It's supposed to stick around approximately like 15 minutes. We don't want it to go too long for a couple of reasons. One, engagement starts to go down and we might just land in compliance mode. And we don't want students to just be compliant in our classroom. We want more for them. Another reason is in those 15 minutes, If the teacher can be curious about kids, watch what they're doing and listen to them, then we start to truly understand what they know, what they don't know yet,
Yeah.
and then we can utilize that information to best meet everyone's needs.
Well, that observation is an assessment.
Absolutely. Every interaction is an assessment,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
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 Um, so when I think about my work with teachers, oftentimes, it's this idea of like, I want to use what I know about kids to drive my instruction,
Yeah.
like to drive my next decision, my decision making. I don't meet teachers who say I'm not willing to ever do that. Everyone wants to do that.
Yeah.
But what I used to do was I talked so much and I did so many problems that I didn't know enough about my students to make the correct instructional decisions for them. So when you can't amplify anyone's voice in the classroom if you fill the space with your own.
Yeah.
You can't
That's true.
learn about what kids know and what they don't know yet if you're the one solving all the problems. So in that focus lesson, it's our opportunity to kind of launch these great lessons, to launch these ideas and to see what kids know and what they're saying to one another. Give students an opportunity to talk with one another and showcase their thinking.
So in that focus lesson, if I'm a parent, and again, I hear this from a lot of people because we hear about standards and what kids need to know. In that focus lesson, are all those kids having access to grade level material?
Yes, 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 because all kids can. And a
Yep.
huge tenet of math workshop is to
Great.
presume competence of children.
Thank you.
It's amazing what they can show us.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, and I think, parents again don't know, and some teachers, if they're not exposed to this, sometimes they think some kids, because as you said, you were not, comfortable or great teaching math. A lot of teachers don't feel that way, and so sometimes you fall back on how you were taught, and then that's when certain kids fall through the cracks, because then we lower our expectations. Oh, this kid comes from here, or this kid and you don't do it on purpose, but you subconsciously say, okay, I don't think they can do that. And it's never about the kid. It's about me. It's about my confidence, my competence.
Yeah. Or your biases that are
Yeah.
creeping through that you need to check.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So our focus lesson is 15 minutes,
Yeah.
and
Uh,
then talk to me through what happens next.
so then we have the great opportunity to work with students in small groups.
And how do
Um,
you set that up?
Yeah, so it's a lot of different ways, and you know, when I think about the different ways that you can group kids into small groups and the work with kids in small groups, I never want this to feel complicated for teachers. I never want teachers to feel like having different ways to do it makes it more complicated. Instead, I want it to feel freeing. So small groups can be done several different ways. One, random. Just grab some kids and get them into some small groups.
Yeah.
Because when I have 4 to 5 kids in front of me, I'm going to be able to listen, to watch. I have the luxury of watching a kid solve a problem from the moment their pencil hits the paper to the very end, which is not something you have the luxury of doing when you have kids in whole group. And sometimes a finished product, that final paper, is not as much information as you need. You need to be able to see kids from start to finish.
Sure.
Um, we get to give immediate feedback. We're able to listen and learn about what they're thinking and ask those really important questions that are appropriate for what the child is doing. So random, just grab some kids and go for it. You're going to learn so much about kids that way. Another way that you could really think about it is, I noticed that these kids were solving these problems in different ways. And how neat it would be to grab kids who solve problems differently and work together to showcase their thinking. So you can really think about it as an opportunity to, as a share with kids so that they can learn from and with one another. And you get to facilitate that.
I love that because, and again, I'm hearing you talk to me as if I'm a parent. I love that because as a parent, and I've heard people say this, When I was, young, or when I was in math class, there was only one way to solve a problem, and so people get stuck that they feel like they have to do it a certain way. And there's so many different ways that we can come to the same, conclusion, but we have our different ways of doing it. And so having kids show how they solve the problem in different ways, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And, when we, as the teacher, we get to see a lot of those different ways. So it's important that we have, we have a place to be able to showcase that and to
Sure.
celebrate it. We don't want a child who maybe shares first for everyone else to think, oh, well, I did it differently, so I'm not going to share. My way must be wrong. We want to create the type of classroom where everyone realizes like these different ways is what really like is exciting about math. There are so many different ways to solve these problems. So, just that small group time is so important because we get to know so much about our students and really watching and listening to them. But in order to do that, other students need to be engaged in some rich mathematics because we don't have time to waste and we
Right.
also don't have time for fluff. So, time is so limited. So if I'm working with 4, 5, 6 students off to the side, other students are engaged in, what I call learning stations. And, as a parent, you just might see them as a lot of fun math games. And they are. The idea is that there are a lot of really fun ways to explore math and these ideas. It doesn't have to be the way you and I did it with like packets of worksheets.
Yeah. Yeah. When parents say, well, I see it. Let's say I'm a parent and you invited me in to look at and watch or observe the math workshop. And I, as a parent, am floored. I'm like, this is so efficient. Kids know when to move from station to station, or rotation, or whatever
Mhm.
you want to call them. And but this is not something that they just did intuitively.
Mhm.
Jen, how did you structure it? How did you actually teach these routines and procedures to make sure that the kids are doing this? Because I can come into a kindergarten class in November or December, and they know, like, depending on the signal from the teacher, where to go and how to move, and it looks seamless. How do you do this?
It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
So, just like anything, it takes time and it takes practice. And we do it over the course of several weeks in the beginning of school. We practice these routines, we practice these procedures, we stop and give lots of feedback. We act out what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. We give a lot of different supports. I use different lists or menus for kids or choice boards so that they see what their options are. I think of something very visible for them to know. Hey, if I'm not working with a teacher, these are the things that I'm allowed to do. And if I'm in a kindergarten classroom, maybe they're moving their picture of their face to the new section of where they go next. And maybe if I'm in a third grade classroom, they have something like a checklist where once they complete one, they check it off and they can go back to it, but only after they've done the other items that are listed there. There are a lot of different ways that you can do these different learning stations, but the idea is these learning stations are engaging, so kids want to do them. And that also helps with classroom management.
Yep.
And so if you spend the time in the beginning really practicing these routines and procedures, it pays off later because you're not dealing with classroom management behaviors of or running around the room trying to help kids with a worksheet that they don't know how to do or they're trying to avoid doing or maybe they're rushing through it just to finish it really quickly. Instead, you have the type of feeling from kids where they like moan and groan when you say it's time to clean up. Like, no,
Love
not
that. Yeah.
yet.
It's like pulling them out of the sandbox or the playground and they don't want to leave. That's awesome.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that's when I've chosen the right kind of stuff. I've hooked them. When kids want to do more math or when they're saying like, oh, do we have a new math game? That's great. Like, yes. That's what we should have for kids. We shouldn't have kids who are saying, I'm not a math person. We should have kids saying, more math games. Or,
Yeah.
indoor recess today because it's storming outside. Let's do a math game.
Yeah. In your learning stations, um, and you talked about, some of the structures and how you group kids. When you're,
Mhm.
let's talk about a grade level team. Let's say like, Jen and Brian, and I'm going to use two of my other math people who I think are just amazing, Tracy Hewlin and Jen Deinhardt, who were, at my school and have written, books. Let's say we are a team and we're planning together and we are talking about the math workshop and we're talking about how we have certain, based on some of our assessments that, some students, could, during this rotation could benefit from being my kids, the students I'm working with in my class could benefit from, working in a rotation or a center in, Jennifer Lemp's class or Tracy.
Yeah.
How do we coordinate that? Because when I talk about grade level teams, they're not your kids or my kids, they're all of our kids. And we want to make sure we take collective responsibility for them. And so this math workshop, sometimes it's not just done in isolation, it's coordinated between classrooms.
Yes. I would say the first step in that is vulnerability. Um,
Yeah.
Being able to just be vulnerable and to say, like this is where we've landed. This is where I feel what this child might need.
Mhm.
And sometimes I know that I've done everything I could, or that I know to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't have any other ideas in my back pocket. So being vulnerable in that team meeting with my teammates to say, "Hey, what else? What else is out there? What else could we possibly do for all of these students?" Sharing this data, sharing the information about kids, whether or not that's the disposition that they have. Like, my kids hate this unit and I don't know why, or they can't stand this learning station and I don't know why. Us sharing their dispositions as well as different scores on assessments is really important. And sometimes we take these things personally, and it's hard not to. But being vulnerable and saying, I need some other ideas. I need some support with this.
And I think, if we teach long enough, even during the year, every teacher's not good at everything or is not effective yet at everything. And so during this cycle, we all are going to be maybe sharing a student or, with somebody else because we feel like somebody else may be teaching this area or be more effective, maybe more effective in this area. Or on the flip side, we might be extending some students during a learning center or learning, station, and we might have students go to a classroom because they're the only student in my class right now who's at this point. So we might have them go to another classroom where there's three other students during that learning station or learning center. And so it's that vulnerability is really key because we're not good at everything, but we can learn from our colleagues. And I believe that if we are, as you said, if we are vulnerable, it's all about the kids. It's helping the kid to get better. And so
Yeah.
if that's something that we are not there yet as an adult, and we see our colleague who is there in that area right now, then we would do it for our own child, give it our own child to somebody else to be helped. Then we should be able to do that for with our colleagues.
Absolutely. I'm teaching an adjunct class right now. I'm adjuncting at George Mason. And one of the things I've told the people who are becoming new teachers
Yeah,
is I have spent the last, I don't know how many years, focusing just on math. And I still have more math to learn. Like,
sure.
there's always going to be more math to learn.
Yeah,
And so never ever feel like you can't ask a question in those team meetings or say, I just don't understand this strategy, or, I need to see that differently, or can we work through that problem together using different numbers so that I can see it?
love
Um,
it.
there will always be more math to learn. And if you wait until you have a level of math knowledge that you feel like you have it all, gosh, we're going to be waiting forever. So be vulnerable. Oh, ask the questions.
And that's actually that shows leadership because a leader is able to be vulnerable. A leader is able to say, I don't know how to do this. Somebody else help me. Because what you're modeling is other people in the room have the same, questions or may have a different question, but are afraid to ask. And so leadership is just putting yourself out there saying, okay, how can I influence others? And that being vulnerable is a way to influence because now the people in the room saying, oh, okay, I can be vulnerable now. And so I think
Mhm.
that's really important. Hey, once we are in the learning stations, at how long in general how long in general are the learning stations? And then after the learning stations, what happens next? Do they come back to the teacher?
Yeah, so the learning stations, I see it done in a variety of ways. Some teachers prefer to set a timer and to say at a certain time, everyone gets up and moves to another station. And I've also seen it done where it's more of a choice board. Once
Yeah,
you've completed this learning station, then you move on and get something else.
sure,
Um, and both work for different reasons, and both have positives and for different reasons. The timer can help with some classroom management.
right,
And the choice board can help when it comes to some really good stations that just might take some kids longer or less time.
sure,
So if Brian and Jennifer are partners and we finish the station in 10 minutes, but the timer is set for 15, we move on and we're doing something else and we're constantly moving and thinking. And, on the flip side, maybe Jennifer and Brian needed 17 minutes, but that timer went off at 15 and we were so close to finishing. And oh man, now we have to clean up and we never got that great satisfaction of completion. So there's no wrong way when it comes to the amount of time. You just need to kind of think through the format of your class, maybe how many stations you have, and what's going to work for maybe your where you are in your educational career too, in terms of like what you're willing to take on, whether or not you feel like the timer is a better fit for you or not. And after that, though, we need to have a system for cleanup and immediately moving into reflection. So we wrap everything up with a reflection. When, for many years, I didn't do any reflection at all. Reflection was pass out your homework, right? Like that was it.
yeah,
Um, and I think that I know that there was one year where my math class was right up against our specials time, and it was like, hurry up, line up, we're gonna be late for art again, or we're gonna be late, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. So saving that time. So one thing I do use a timer for is myself, because I would have to set the timer so that I would save that last 5 to 10 minutes every day, because reflection for anyone is important. Reflecting on their learning, reflecting, thinking about their questions and their connections in the last 5 to 10 minutes. And so that can look like a couple of different things too. I've had kids just turn and talk to a shoulder partner. Tell them about a strategy that you saw a student use today. Maybe they're writing something down and turning that into me, and I can use that as another piece of data. Where are they in their feelings? Sometimes it's a whiteboard that they hold up and they're like, smiley face, sad face on how they're feeling about this unit right now, or a fist to five, this is how I feel, or maybe my effort today was only a 3. Students reflecting on themselves as a learner in their classroom, reflecting on their feelings about math, and reflecting on the strategies and the information that was shared that day is important.
yeah. I think, when you talk about reflection, it really is an assessment, a self-assessment, right? It's like, okay, I was here, now I'm here, I want to get here, or I didn't get as far as I wanted to get. What in this area, what do I need to do to move forward? And I think that's critical at the end of that classroom. So, I mean, I love that. We are almost out of time. Jen, this has been amazing. And we haven't even gotten through. You're gonna have to come back. We haven't even gotten through a lot of the things I wanted to talk
I
about.
would love to.
One
Well,
of
my second book is coming out in November, so maybe we can come back and talk
yeah.
about one.
And
That one
is that for grades 6 through 12?
It is because
Yeah.
math workshop, while with the way we just described it, I used several elementary examples from the book that's currently out, but math workshop, because it's really about a philosophy,
Yeah.
as well as a lesson plan idea, is really something that's a K-12 approach. This is not just an elementary thing. This is about best practices for kids of any age and strategies for teachers. So it's really a K-12 approach. So the 6-12 book is coming out soon.
That's awesome. So one of the things I have, kind of preached my entire career, and I think sometimes people at the beginning were not really clear, but I would always say all you need to go to do to see this type of approach, go see a sports practice. They're doing the workshop model. You will see, them starting off with, this whole group lesson. You'll see them doing, learning stations where people are working on their individual skills. You'll see them doing whole group. You'll see them doing coming back to together at the end of practice. You're reflecting. It's been done for years, but we've just incorporated it into schools, recently, and you've really put it, together perfectly in a book. But it's not, again, people will say, well, this is just, for little kids. It's not. It's
Mhm.
a structure for and a philosophy that should be for everybody, and it's about equity. Think about the math workshop and how I didn't hear once where you said, oh, we're going to pull certain kids out of this classroom every day because they can't. No,
No.
it's like every kid in this class can, and we're going to start with they can, and we're going to make sure that we, the adults, figure out how we structure it so we're maximizing their learning. And
Absolutely.
you
No,
were
that sports analogy is perfect, Brian. Absolutely.
So, and then I wanted, I didn't even touch on the 20 days to a classroom culture. And I think that's something that, we'll talk about when you come back, because you have to come back, because this time it just flew by, and very informative. It was really something that I think people needed to hear, teachers and parents. And you did a really great job. Jen, one of the things that I do at the end of my podcast, I share this quote that I shared at my dad's funeral about 4 years ago. And it goes, "As I go, I am wearing you." And what it is just talks about all the people. When you see Brian Butler, you don't see Brian Butler. You see all the hundreds of people who have poured into him, the coaches, the teachers, the family members, the community members. I'm wearing all those people when I go on stage, when I'm on my podcast, because it's not Brian Butler. You're seeing just a beautiful, array of people who are just I'm wearing, and I just take with me to try to help make this a better world. And so today, after this conversation, I am now, and I have been before because I've known you and I've known your work, but today, even more importantly, is I'm wearing Jennifer Lempp. And so I do appreciate you coming on. And, I'll see you next week in Chicago.
Yes,
Yes,
I can't wait.
everybody. Jennifer's going to be at NCSM, the math conference in Chicago. You're presenting in a couple days, right?
Yes, and I can't wait to see your closing keynote, Brian. I'm excited for it.
I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to learning. I'm coming in the night before, but I'm gonna try to sneak into some sessions on Wednesday so I can learn from some people, because I am truly just in awe of all the educators who will be there, and just a wonderful lineup, and just looking forward to learning myself. So thanks again for coming on, and we'll see you very soon, friend.
Thank you, Brian. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Subscribe to A Conversation with Brian on my YouTube channel and Spotify.